The roar of a nearby shuttle's engines echoed across the sprawling military base as he stepped off the transport. The human man, clad in the grease-stained jumpsuit of a mechanic, hefted his bag over one shoulder. His dark hair was tousled, and his hands bore the faint, permanent grime of someone who lived with machinery. Around him, soldiers and personnel moved with purpose, their uniforms pristine and faces determined. The base felt cold, utilitarian, and unfamiliar. He glanced at the shimmering towers of glass and alloy that pierced the skyline, marveling at how alien technology blended seamlessly into the barren landscape of the distant moon. This wasn't his first assignment on a joint species base, but it was his first time so far from Earth. He scanned his orders again, frowning at the unfamiliar designation of his quarters. The thought of sharing a space gnawed at him, especially with someone he hadn't met. Still, orders were orders, and he wasn't about to start his assignment by questioning protocol. He reached the designated door, its smooth curved frame glowing faintly with a soft blue light. When it slid open, he froze. Inside, an alien woman was meticulously organizing a set of tools on a floating workbench. Her skin was a pearlescent shade of lavender, her hair flowing like silver threads, catching the ambient light. She wore a uniform tailored to her species, sleek and practical, but it couldn't hide the graceful lines of her figure. She turned at the sound of the door, her silver eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his disheveled appearance. "You must be my quarters mate," she said, her voice lilting, accented in a way that was both musical and clipped. She gestured toward a neatly arranged bunk. "I've taken the left side." He stepped in, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "Great. Just great," he muttered, tossing his bag onto the unclaimed side. Silence stretched between them as he tried not to stare. She moved with an efficiency that made him feel clumsy, each motion precise as she returned to calibrating her tools. He noticed the faint scars on her hands, the telltale marks of an engineer who had spent years working with volatile systems. She wasn't just beautiful, she was experienced, competent, and clearly used to commanding respect. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "what's your specialty?" Her eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "Energy systems. You. Mechanics. Fixing engines. Patching hulls. You name it." She gave a small nod, turning back to her work. "Then we'll stay out of each other's way." He watched her for a moment longer, then turned his attention to his side of the room. The bunk was standard issue, hard mattress, scratchy blanket, no room for comfort. A small desk sat to one side, its surface already occupied by a few basic tools he'd brought along. He pulled open the drawers and began unpacking, placing spanners and diagnostic pads in a neat row. The familiar routine grounded him, but the faint scent of something floral lingered in the air, reminding him that this was far from home. She moved with practiced precision, adjusting the intricate energy array on the workbench. The alien symbols on the tool display blinked rhythmically, and he couldn't help but marvel at her focus. She worked like someone with a purpose, someone who didn't tolerate distractions. "Do you always stare at people when they're working?" she asked without looking up. He flinched, his ears burning. "Wasn't staring. Just curious. Haven't seen anyone work on a rig like that before." Her silver eyes met his again, and for the first time, there was a hint of amusement in them. "It's a power coupler for the shield grid. Not something a mechanic would handle." He shrugged, leaning back against his bunk. "Hey, if it's broken, I'll still be the one crawling in the guts to fix it. Fancy tools don't mean much when the system's jammed." She raised an eyebrow but didn't reply, turning back to her work. The silence between them stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the workbench and the occasional clink of tools. Finally, he sighed and sat down. "Look, if we're stuck sharing this space, we might as well make the best of it. What do I call you?" She paused, setting down her tool. "Rheia." "Rheia," he repeated, the name rolling awkwardly off his tongue. "I'm Connor." Her lips quirked, not quite a smile but close. "Connor. Human names are simple." He snorted. "Simple's better. Less room for confusion. Perhaps." She returned to her work, but her posture seemed less rigid now. He leaned back, watching as the dim light of the room played off her features. She was stunning, sure, but there was something more, an intensity that made her seem untouchable. He knew better than to entertain any thoughts beyond professionalism, especially in a place like this. But still, sharing quarters with someone like her? It was going to be a long assignment. The next morning, they received their first joint assignment. A critical system failure in the outer perimeter defenses had brought operations to a halt. Connor grabbed his toolkit, slinging it over one shoulder, while Rheia reviewed the specifications on her holographic display. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked as they headed toward the transport bay. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said, grinning. "Unless you're planning to leave me behind." "Not likely," she said. "You're the only one here who knows how to recalibrate the older human systems." He couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a dig, but he decided to let it slide. The transport shuttle was cramped, and he found himself sitting shoulder to shoulder with her. The faint floral scent he'd noticed in their quarters lingered, mixing with a sharp tang of coolant from their tools. The worksite was a mess when they arrived. Sparks flew from exposed circuits, and a faint plume of smoke wafted from a ruptured console. Connor whistled low. "Looks like someone didn't follow the manual." "Or the manual was inadequate," Rheia said, kneeling beside the console. Her fingers flew over the holographic interface, isolating the damaged components. Connor crouched beside her, pulling out a set of tools. "Manual or not, this thing's toast. We'll need to strip it down to the core." She didn't argue, handing him a diagnostic pad. "I'll stabilize the power flow. You handle the rebuild." They worked in near silence, their movements oddly synchronized. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same tool. He glanced up, meeting her gaze for a fraction of a second before she looked away. "Efficient," she said, almost as if to herself. "What? You're more competent than I expected," she admitted, her tone neutral. He smirked. "Don't sound too impressed." She didn't reply, but he thought he saw the faintest flicker of a smile. Hours later, they returned to their quarters, both exhausted but satisfied. The perimeter defenses were online, and the base's command center had sent their thanks. Connor dropped onto his bunk, groaning as he stretched out. "Not bad for our first mission," he said. Rheia was already at her workbench, reviewing the data logs from the repairs. "Adequate," she said. "But there's room for improvement." "High standards," he muttered. "You always this demanding?" She turned, fixing him with a steady gaze. "This is a military base, not a repair shop on Earth. If we don't meet high standards, people die." Her words hit harder than he expected, and he nodded. "Fair point." For a moment, the tension in the room hung heavy, but then she turned back to her logs, and he let himself relax. As he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that their partnership was just beginning, and that it was going to be anything but simple. The next few weeks passed in a blur of assignments. It seemed the base was constantly on the verge of one crisis or another, and Connor and Rheia were often paired to handle the most critical repairs. Over time, they developed an unspoken rhythm. Her analytical precision complemented his improvisational problem-solving. Though their methods often clashed, the results were undeniable. Systems got fixed faster, and downtime was minimized. Their quarters, however, remained a battleground of sorts. Rhea's meticulous habits often clashed with Connor's more laid-back approach. She arranged her tools in perfect alignment, each one glowing faintly on its magnetic rack, while his side of the room looked like a scrapyard explosion. At first, she commented on it daily. "Do humans take pride in chaos?" she asked one evening, her tone sharp as she surveyed his cluttered desk. Connor glanced up from the engine module he was tinkering with. "It's not chaos. It's organized disorder. I know where everything is." Her silver eyes narrowed. "Until you don't. And then you waste time looking for it." He grinned. "Keeps life exciting." She didn't smile back. "Excitement is overrated." Despite their differences, moments of mutual respect began to emerge. One night, after a grueling repair on a fractured coolant line, Rheia handed him a steaming cup of what he assumed was tea. It smelled earthy and sharp, unlike anything he'd tasted before. "What's this?" he asked, sniffing it cautiously. "It's called Silka. It's calming." She settled into her chair, cradling her own cup. "You looked like you needed it." He took a sip, wincing at the bitterness but appreciating the gesture. "Thanks." Didn't know you cared. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You're competent. I prefer my colleagues alive and functional. Touching, he said with a chuckle. Their partnership was put to the test during a catastrophic power outage that plunged half the base into darkness. Emergency protocols activated, but vital systems, including life support in the lower levels, were failing. Command summoned them to the control room, where the base commander, a stern-faced insectoid alien, briefed them. The main power core is destabilizing, the commander explained, his mandibles clicking in agitation. You'll need to bypass the primary conduits and reroute power manually. This is a critical mission. Connor and Rheia exchanged a look. How much time do we have? She asked. 40 minutes at most, the commander replied. They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the base. The power core was an imposing structure, its glowing central cylinder pulsing erratically. Sparks rained from severed cables, and the air smelled of burnt ozone. Looks worse than I thought, Connor muttered. Rheia scanned the core with her diagnostic pad. The main stabilizer is offline. I'll handle the energy modulation. You reroute the conduits. Got it, he said, already pulling out tools. The next half hour was a blur of frantic activity. Connor worked with practiced efficiency, his hands flying over the conduits as he rewired connections and sealed leaks. Meanwhile, Rheia balanced the volatile energy flow, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Connor, she shouted suddenly. The energy surge is too strong. If we don't synchronize the bypass now, the core will overload. On it, he yelled back, sweat dripping down his face. He made the final connection and shouted, "Hit it!" Rheia activated the bypass, and the core's erratic pulses steadied into a rhythmic hum. The lights flickered back to life, and the base's systems came online. They slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. For a moment, neither spoke. "Good work," she said finally, glancing at him. "You too," he replied, managing a tired smile. "Guess we make a decent team." She didn't argue, and that, he realized, was as close to a compliment as he'd get. Back in their quarters, the exhaustion hit them both like a freight shuttle. Connor collapsed onto his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Rheia sat at her workbench, but instead of diving into another project, she simply stared at her hands. "You okay?" he asked, propping himself up on one elbow. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's just, moments like that remind me why I'm here. Why we do this." He nodded. "Yeah. Saving a bunch of lives. It's not a bad day's work." She looked at him, her silver eyes softening. "You did well today, Connor." "Thanks, Rheia," he said, grinning. "You're not so bad yourself." For the first time, she smiled, a real smile. It was fleeting, but it was there, and it lit up her face in a way that made his chest tighten. He quickly looked away, focusing on the mess on his desk. "Maybe tomorrow," she said, "we can organize your tools." "Don't push your luck," he said, but there was no heat in his words. Their dynamic continued to evolve, a mix of banter, camaraderie, and growing mutual respect. Over time, Connor found himself looking forward to their shared missions, even to their quiet evenings in the quarters. Rheia, too, seemed to soften, her once impenetrable demeanor giving way to moments of warmth. One evening, as they reviewed blueprints for a new shield generator, she leaned back and asked, "Do you miss Earth?" The question caught him off guard. He set down his tablet, thinking. Sometimes. Mostly the little things. The smell of rain, real coffee, stuff like that. "What about you? Do you miss wherever you're from?" Her expression grew distant. "Yes. But my people value duty above personal desire. Missing home isn't an excuse to falter." He nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "Duty's a heavy thing." "It is," she said softly. For a moment, their eyes met, and the space between them felt smaller than it ever had. Their relationship, whatever it was becoming, didn't go unnoticed. Other personnel whispered about the human mechanic and the alien engineer who always seemed to work in perfect sync. Some speculated, others mocked. But neither Connor nor Rheia paid it much attention. They were too busy saving the base, one crisis at a time. Yet, as their missions grew more dangerous and their bond deepened, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that this partnership, this fragile connection, was becoming the most important thing in his life. Whether it was professional or something more, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that he didn't want it to end. The next mission pushed them both to their limits. A hostile fleet had been detected on the outskirts of the system, forcing the base into high alert. Every department was stretched thin, preparing for the possibility of an imminent attack. Connor and Rheia were tasked with upgrading the base's defensive systems, a monumental job that left little room for error. The two of them spent hours in the engineering bay, surrounded by piles of equipment and blueprints. Rheia worked tirelessly, her focus unshakable as she calibrated shield amplifiers and rewired targeting arrays. Connor, equally determined, tackled the base's outdated weapons platforms, patching centuries-old human tech into alien systems. "Do you ever sleep?" Connor asked one night, glancing at her as she fine-tuned a power relay. "Not often," she admitted, not looking up. "There's too much to do." He leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're going to burn out at this rate." "I'll rest when the base is secure," she said firmly. He studied her for a moment, noticing the faint circles under her silver eyes. "You can't carry the whole base on your shoulders, you know." She paused, her hands stilling for just a moment. "I'm not carrying it alone. I have you." The words were simple, almost casual, but they struck him like a punch to the chest. He didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Instead, he picked up his tools and got back to work, hoping she didn't notice the way his ears turned red. The following morning, alarms blared across the base. The hostile fleet had entered the system, and their scouts were already engaging the outer patrols. Connor and Rheia barely had time to finish their upgrades before being summoned to the command center. The base commander stood at the center of the war room, his insectoid mandibles clicking nervously as holograms displayed the incoming threat. "The enemy fleet has bypassed our outer defenses," the commander said. "Their next target will be the base. Our shield should hold, thanks to your upgrades, but the weapon systems are another matter. You two will be stationed in the central control hub. If anything fails, you're our best chance of fixing it." "Understood," Rheia said, her voice steady. Connor nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just another repair job. Lives were at stake. Hundreds of them. As they took their positions in the control hub, Connor glanced at Rheia. "You ready for this?" "I'm always ready," she said, though her grip on the console was tighter than usual. The attack began moments later. The enemy ships were relentless, their weapons hammering the base's shields. Explosions rocked the structure, and the control hub was filled with the chaotic chatter of reports and commands. Connor and Rheia worked side by side, monitoring the systems and making rapid adjustments as needed. "Shield integrity at 60%. Rheia called out, her fingers flying over the controls. "We need to redistribute power to the forward generators." "On it," Connor replied, diving into the systems to reroute the flow. Forward generators stabilized, but were losing power in the aft section. "Divert secondary reserves," she instructed, "and watch for overloads in the auxiliary conduits." He nodded, following her lead. 4 hours, they fought to keep the base operational, their teamwork a seamless blend of precision and instinct. But then, a direct hit struck the weapons platform they had upgraded the night before. The explosion sent a shockwave through the base, knocking them both to the ground. Connor groaned, pushing himself up. "Status." Rhea's voice was tight. "The platform is offline. We've lost our primary firepower. Can we bring it back?" he asked, already moving toward the diagnostic panel. "Not remotely," she said grimly. "We'll have to go there." "Figures," he muttered. "Let's move." The platform was a war zone. Flames licked at the edges of the chamber, and debris littered the floor. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint hum of failing systems echoed ominously. Rheia assessed the damage quickly. "The main power relay is severed. I'll stabilize the circuit. You handle the turret controls." "Got it," Connor said, already pulling out his tools. They worked under the constant threat of another attack, their movements quick and precise. Sweat dripped down Connor's face as he reconnected the turret's targeting array, his hands shaking with the effort. Meanwhile, Rheia knelt beside the power relay, her silver hair catching the light as she fused the damaged conduits. "Connor," she called out, her voice strained. "We don't have much time." "I know," he shouted back, tightening the final bolt. "Almost there." The turret controls lit up, and the weapons platform roared back to life. Rheia activated the power relay, and the lights stabilized, casting the room in a steady glow. "We did it," she said, her voice barely audible over the chaos outside. Connor grinned, his heart pounding. "Not bad for a mechanic and an engineer." She smiled, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Then another explosion rocked the base, and reality came crashing back. The battle raged on for hours, but thanks to their efforts, the base held. When the enemy fleet finally retreated, a wave of relief swept through the command center. Connor and Rheia returned to their quarters, utterly exhausted. Sitting on his bunk, Connor glanced at her. "You think they'll ever let us sleep again?" She chuckled softly, a sound he'd rarely heard from her. "Doubtful." He smiled, leaning back against the wall. "Still, we make a pretty good team." She looked at him, her silver eyes warm. "Yes, we do." For the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable. Whatever lay ahead, they knew they could face it together. And for now, that was enough.